Chapter 43, we're going to talk about absolute music and look at Johannes Brahms. Absolute music in the Romantic era is different than program music, meaning it's not associated with anything literary. And absolute music is going to be found in multi-movement genres like the symphony, the concerto, and chamber music. The form may vary, but the form really functions as an organizing element. So there's not one specific form associated with it, but it definitely would have some organization. The Romantic composers did allow themselves more freedoms with structures more than the classical, though, so keep that in mind. The repertoire continues to dominate orchestral concerts. This is what the preference was for people attending orchestral concerts. Absolute music. Form and expression in the Romantic Symphony was a little bit more suited for public concert halls. And that had something to do with the fact that the orchestra was so large at this point. So the palace would not have necessarily held it. Here's a little painting engraving of one of the performances, and you can see how large the orchestra is, how large the audience is. This was a concert in London at the Covent Garden Theatre. So the symphony really was a good structure for absolute music, and the composers used it as a framework because it was longer. It was a multi-movement piece. It had more instruments, so it was more expansive. You could do more themes, musical themes, and more expression and harmonic expression in that. The loose form that it would follow, the symphony in the 19th century, would be the first movement being the most dramatic, and generally a sonata allegro form, which we had talked about in the last unit. Sometimes they put a slow introduction in the front of that movement, but typically it was longer than the classical era first movement, and it was somewhat of an expressive development. And then movement 2 would still have that slower style, similar to the classical, a little bit more loose though, and still very lyrical. Movement 3 still held on to that rhythmic dance or scherzo, and it might have elements of humor or surprise, or even folk dances were popular. And movement 4, usually back to sonata allegro form, and usually there was some conclusion, a note of triumph, as the piece kind of comes to a close there. The person that we're going to listen to the example of that was very famous in the 19th century for symphonies was Johannes Brahms, born in 1833 and died in 1897. He actually was mentored by Robert and Clara Schumann, if you remember talking about them. Moved to Vienna, was a very successful German composer. He was very traditional in his style, stuck to classical forms and absolute music, and really had an affection for folk music as well, and included that in his compositions. There's a picture of him. When he was 40, he began composing symphonic works, like his symphonies and concertos. He only wrote 4 symphonies, 4 concertos, only 4, but wrote a lot of chamber music and piano and songs. So he's had that was a little bit more of his output. But the symphony we're going to listen to is Symphony Number 3 that he wrote at age 50. It's actually the shortest of his symphonies. It's got a little bit of a romantic theme in its moods and timbres. This is a picture of his study and library. The forms are very classical in structure, and you'll hopefully find that you can pick out a 3-note motive in the beginning, and that 3-note motive connects the whole symphony. You'll hear it all throughout. You're not going to listen to the whole thing, though. You're going to listen to the 3rd movement, which is a waltz, that dance rhythm, in a ABA format, which is, you've got that repetition of A, but when it repeats, it's going to be in a slightly different, altered way. That's what that A with that prime mark on it. It's written in C minor, even though the symphony is in F major. You're going to hear some complex rhythms, some syncopation. See if you can find that cello melody. The B section is the contrasting section, which will be in a major key. And then it ends quietly, and you're going to have that last chord, which is pizzicato or plucked strings. So follow along with the listening guide, and the timeline will help you know what to listen for.